The woman weighed 168 pounds. She had not sat down on a training mat since 1954. Not during competition, not during practice, not during the 14 years she spent turning ordinary Soviet boys into Olympic gold medalists. Sitting was surrender. Sitting was what happened to the people she coached against. And yet, on the 12th of October 1968, in a rented gymnasium 6 blocks east of the Olympic Village in Mexico City, Valentina Nikolaevna Kuznetsova sat down on a mat in front of a man who weighed 60 pounds less than her smallest athlete. She was not pushed. She was not thrown. She was not struck. She sat because for the first time in 19 years of studying every fighting system on Earth, she saw something she had never seen before, and it broke something inside her understanding that she did not know could break. The man standing across from her was 27 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds. His name was Bruce Lee, and he had not moved from the spot where he was standing when she walked through the door 4 minutes earlier. He moved once during those 4 minutes, just once. And that single movement is the reason Valentina Kuznetsova, a woman who had watched over 400 competitive matches without flinching, a woman whose Soviet wrestlers called her Zheleznaya Stena, the Iron Wall, sat down on a floor she had no business sitting on, in a country she had no business being impressed in, and stared at a man she had no business underestimating. But to understand why that moment mattered, you need to understand who she was before she walked through that door. And to understand that, you need to go back, not to that morning, not to that week. You need to go back to Stalingrad. Valentina Nikolaevna Kuznetsova was born on the 11th of February 1927 in the city that would become the most destroyed place in modern history. Her father, Nikolai, was a factory foreman at the Barakadi gun factory on the banks of the Volga River. Her mother, Yelena, operated a munitions stamping press on the night shift at the same facility. Valentina was 15 years old when the German Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in August of 1942. Her father was conscripted into a workers' militia unit on September 3rd. He was killed 11 days later during fighting near the grain elevator on the southern edge of the city. His body was never recovered. Valentina's mother continued working the night shift through the entire siege. 6 months, she stamped shell casings while the building shook from artillery impacts. She lost the hearing in her left ear from the concussions. She never complained. Valentina watched her mother walk to work through rubble every evening and return every morning, covered in metal dust and plaster powder, and she learned something that would define her entire life. She learned that strength is not what you display. Strength is what you repeat. Night after night, shell after shell, step after step through the rubble. You do not stop. You do not sit down. You do not show the enemy that anything they have done has reached you. After the war, the Soviet Sports Ministry sent talent scouts to every school in the reconstructed city. They were looking for children with specific physical attributes: broad shoulders, low center of gravity, fast twitch muscle response, high pain tolerance. Valentina was 9 years old when a scout pulled her out of a gymnastics line and placed her in front of a wrestling coach named Viktor Petrov. Petrov watched her for 10 seconds, then told the scout, "This one doesn't move like the others. She moves like she's already angry." She began wrestling that week. By 14, she was training with boys 2 years older and 30 pounds heavier. By 16, she had broken a male sparring partner's collarbone during a regional demonstration match. The ministry reviewed the footage. They did not punish her. They promoted her, but not to competition. Women's wrestling was not recognized by the Soviet Olympic Committee. They made her a coach instead. She was 22 years old. She had never competed in a single official match. And they gave her 6 men and told her to produce a gold medalist within 4 years. She produced 2. At the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, her wrestlers won gold in Greco-Roman 73 kg and freestyle 62 kg. She was 25. The youngest wrestling coach in Soviet Olympic history, the only woman. And the beginning of a record that by October of 1968 looked like this: 6 Olympic gold medals, 14 World Championship medals, and a 41 match-winning streak that stretched across the 1964 Tokyo Games and into the Mexico City Games without interruption. She had never produced a silver medalist on purpose. Her athletes either won gold or they were removed from her program and reassigned to regional coaching positions in Siberian mining towns. There was no middle ground. There was no acceptable loss. There was gold and there was Siberia. Her wrestlers understood this. The international wrestling community understood this, and by 1968, the woman the Western coaches called the Iron Curtain was considered the single most successful combat sports coach in the history of the Olympic Games. Not the most successful wrestling coach, the most successful combat sports coach. Period. And she had built that record on one core belief that she held with the certainty of a woman who had survived Stalingrad. All fighting was wrestling. Every combat system in the world, boxing, judo, karate, Muay Thai, Savate, whatever the Brazilians were doing on their beaches, was simply an incomplete version of wrestling. Striking was decoration, kicking was panic. Submissions were what happened after you had already been taken to the ground by a wrestler. The wrestler decided where the fight took place. The wrestler decided when the fight ended. The wrestler was the one constant in 5,000 years of human combat, and everything else was theatre. She had tested this belief at every opportunity. At the 1956 Melbourne Olympics, she watched a Japanese judoka throw a practice partner and told her translator, "That is wrestling with a costume." At the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, she watched a karate demonstration and told the same translator, "That is dancing with anger." She had been approached by boxing coaches, Savate instructors, a Muay Thai champion from Bangkok, and a Brazilian who claimed his family had invented a ground fighting system that could defeat any wrestler alive. She listened to all of them. She invited 3 of them to demonstrate against her athletes. All 3 were on the ground within 20 seconds. The Brazilian lasted 30. She was polite about it. She thanked each one, and then she returned to her belief, reinforced, verified, proven correct for the 63rd, 64th, 65th time. Nothing surprised her, nothing impressed her, no technique, no fighter, no system had ever made her pause long enough to reconsider a single element of her philosophy. Until October 12, 1968, until she heard something she could not categorize coming from behind an open door. The gymnasium was called Gymnasio Flores. It was a converted warehouse on Calle Dinamarca, 6 blocks east of the Olympic Village, rented by various national delegations for overflow training when the official facilities were full. On the morning of October 12th, Valentina had finished a final preparation session with her 2 remaining athletes, Dmitry Volkov, 24 years old, 198 pounds, Greco-Roman 90-kilogram class, bronze medal favorite, and Grigory Pavlovich, 29 years old, 220 pounds, freestyle 100-kilogram class, silver medalist in Tokyo, gold medal favorite in Mexico City. Both men had been under her coaching for 6 years. Both men were, by her assessment, within 3% of their physical ceiling. Both men feared her more than they feared any opponent they would face on the mat. She was walking them back to the Soviet delegation hotel, the route past Gymnasio Flores. The door was open. And through that open door, Valentina heard a sound that stopped her mid-stride. It was breathing. But not the breathing she knew, not the rhythmic exhale of a wrestler driving through a takedown, not the sharp grunt of a boxer throwing a cross, not the hissing ki of a karateka striking a board. This was something else entirely. Short, fast exhales, clustered in bursts of 3 or 4, separated by pauses of absolute silence. The rhythm was irregular but not random. It sounded controlled, intentional, like a language she had never heard spoken. She stopped walking. Dmitry and Grigory stopped behind her. Her translator, Elena Marquez, a Mexican-born Soviet embassy staffer who had been assigned to Valentina for the duration of the games, nearly collided with Grigory's back. Valentina turned her head toward the open door. She listened for 4 more seconds, then she walked toward it. The gymnasium was small, 40 feet by 30 feet, concrete floor with a thin rubber mat covering approximately half the space. One overhead fluorescent light, buzzing, a water pipe in the corner with a slow drip that echoed against the walls. No mirrors, no equipment except a heavy bag hanging from a ceiling chain in the far corner, and a wooden dummy, a vertical post with 3 protruding arms, standing near the back wall, and in the center of the mat, a man. He was shirtless. His back was to the door. He was moving in a way Valentina could not immediately classify, and Valentina Kuznetsova classified everything. It was the foundation of her coaching method: observe, categorize, identify weakness, exploit. She could watch a wrestler for 15 seconds and tell you which knee would buckle first, which shoulder had been injured in the past year, which side they favored when fatigued. She had been doing this since she was 22 years old. It was reflexive. It was instant. It was not working now. The man was not boxing. His feet were wrong for boxing. One pointed forward, one angled at roughly 15 degrees. Weight distributed unevenly, in a way that would get a boxer knocked off balance by any decent hook. But he wasn't being knocked off balance because he wasn't standing still long enough for the imbalance to matter. He shifted, constantly. Not the lateral movement of a boxer working a ring, not the circular footwork of a wrestler angling for position, not the rigid forward and back stepping of a karateka. He moved the way water moves when you pour it into a container that keeps changing shape, filling whatever space was available, then emptying it before you could register what you had seen. Every 3 or 4 movements he struck something invisible. His fist or his foot or his elbow would accelerate from stillness to full extension, so fast that Valentina heard the air displace before she saw the limb move. A sharp crack, like a wet towel snapping, then stillness, then the fluid movement again, then another crack. She counted his muscle groups because that was what she did. Deltoids disproportionately developed for his frame. Forearms braided, dense. The kind of forearm development you see in gymnasts or rock climbers, not fighters. Latissimus dorsi, flaring visibly with each rotation, wider than they should be on a man with a 28-inch waist. His waist. That was the part that confused her most. It was impossibly narrow. Wrestlers needed core mass. Boxers needed core mass. Every fighter she had ever studied carried their power in the torso. This man carried his power everywhere except his torso. It radiated from his shoulders, his hips, his wrists, even his feet. She could see the tendons in his feet flexing against the mat with each shift. But his center was hollow, light, empty. He was built wrong for every sport she knew, and yet every movement was efficient in a way that made her uncomfortable. There was no wasted motion, no repositioning, no recovery. Each movement flowed into the next without a seam, without a pause, without the micro-hesitation that every fighter on earth displays between the end of one technique and the beginning of another. That hesitation, that gap between movements, was where Valentina's entire coaching system lived. She trained her wrestlers to attack in that gap. She had built 6 gold medals on that gap, and this man did not have one. She had been standing in the doorway for approximately 30 seconds. The man had not noticed her. Or if he had not acknowledged her. She took one step onto the mat, the rubber compressed slightly under her shoe. The man stopped moving. He did not turn around. He simply stopped, mid-motion, one hand extended, the other drawn back, his weight on his front foot, and held perfectly still, like someone had pressed pause on a film projector. 3 seconds of silence, the dripping pipe, the buzzing fluorescent. Then he turned around. He was young, younger than she expected from the maturity of his movement. Late 20s, she guessed, Chinese features, high cheekbones, dark eyes that were not hostile, not curious, not friendly. They were assessing. He was doing to her exactly what she had just done to him, reading her body, counting her muscle groups, measuring her stance, calculating her threat level. She recognized the process because it was her process, and she recognized with a discomfort she had not felt in a very long time that he was finishing his assessment faster than she had finished hers. He picked up a towel from the floor beside the wooden dummy, wiped his face, draped the towel over his left shoulder, and waited. Dmitry and Grigori had entered behind her, 218 pounds of Soviet wrestling excellence, standing to her left and right like palace guards. Elena slipped in last, clutching a small leather notebook. Valentina looked at the man for 5 more seconds. Then she said, in Russian, a sentence that Elena translated into English. "Show me something I haven't seen." The man held her gaze. No smile, no flinch, no puffing of the chest, no shifting of weight into a fighting stance. He simply looked at her the way you look at a math equation that has presented itself unexpectedly, with interest and patience and absolutely no urgency. Then he said 6 words. Elena translated them back into Russian. "What have you seen?" Valentina blinked. This was not the response she was accustomed to. When she told fighters to show her something, they showed her something. They demonstrated, they performed, they tried to impress. That was what fighters did. They displayed. This man was not displaying. He was asking her to display first. He was reversing the dynamic, and he was doing it so quietly, so naturally, that it took her a full 2 seconds to realize he had taken control of the conversation without raising his voice, without changing his posture, without doing anything at all except asking a question. She answered. Through Elena, she listed what she had seen: Olympic wrestling, Greco-Roman and freestyle, judo, Kodokan and competition, sambo, combat and sport, boxing, western, orthodox and southpaw. Muay Thai, she had watched the Thai delegation train in Tokyo in '64, karate, Shotokan, Goju-Ryu, Kyorakushin, savate, catch wrestling, Brazilian ground techniques she did not have a name for. She had watched all of them, she had studied all of them, she had defeated all of them, through her athletes in competition. The man nodded at each one, not dismissively, not impatiently. He nodded the way a student nods when a professor is listing prerequisites. When she finished, he said one sentence: "You've seen systems, you haven't seen a person." Elenta translated. Valentina heard the words in Russian. She understood them grammatically. She did not understand them practically. What did that mean? She hadn't seen a person. Every system was performed by a person. The person was irrelevant. The system was what mattered. The technique was what mattered. You could replace the person inside any system, and the system would function identically if the technique was correct. That was the entire foundation of Soviet athletic training. The person was a vehicle. The system was the engine. She told Elena to translate her response. A person is only as good as the system they train. The man tilted his head slightly. 1 degree, maybe 2. And he said, "Then your system has never met someone without one." And Valentina felt something she had not felt since she was 15 years old. Standing in the rubble of Stalingrad, watching her mother walk to work through a city that was trying to kill her. She felt the floor shift beneath a belief she thought was permanent. She turned to Dmitri. She spoke one sentence in Russian that Elena did not need to translate because the meaning was clear in every language. "Get on the mat." Dmitri Volkov stepped onto the mat the way he stepped onto every mat. Left foot first, weight centered, arms loose at his sides but not relaxed, coiled, the way a spring looks loose until you touch it. He was 24 years old, 5 feet 11 inches, 198 pounds. His hands were disproportionately large for his frame, thick across the knuckles, with fingers that could wrap around a human wrist and overlap by half an inch. His grip strength had been measured at the Soviet National Training Center in Moscow at 180 pounds per hand. His training partners described being grabbed by Dmitri Volkov, the way you might describe being caught in a machine. Not painful at first, just absolute. There was no negotiation, there was no wiggling free. Once his fingers closed, the conversation was over, and the only remaining question was how quickly you accepted that. He had been wrestling since he was 17 years. His father had wrestled, his grandfather had wrestled in Soviet army camps during the war. Wrestling was not a sport in the Volkov family, it was a language, and Dmitri spoke it with the fluency of a man who had never needed to learn any other. He looked at the Chinese man standing in the center of the mat, 135 pounds, shirtless, a towel over one shoulder. Dmitri had thrown men heavier than himself hundreds of times. He had controlled men faster than himself dozens of times. He had never lost to a man lighter than himself, not once, not in training, not in competition, not in the unsanctioned grappling matches that Soviet wrestlers held in the basement of the Moscow Training Center after hours, where there were no weight classes and no referees, and the only rule was that you stopped when someone tapped or when Coach Kuznetsov's voice came through the door like a blade. The Chinese man set one condition through the translator: no timer, no points. Either person could use whatever method they chose. The engagement ended when one person was placed in a position they could not escape. Valentina agreed before Dmitri could process the terms. She was not concerned about the terms. She was concerned about time. She wanted to see this resolved quickly so she could categorize it and move on with her day. She expected 15 seconds. Dmitri settled into his stance. Left foot forward, right foot back, knees bent, hips low, hands up at chest height with the fingers open, the classic Soviet Greco-Roman posture, designed to control the upper body, nullify strikes, and close distance for a clinch or a throw. Every element of this stance had been refined across 40 years of Soviet wrestling research. The angle of the feet, the distance between the heels, the height of the hands relative to the chin. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was aesthetic. Everything was engineered for one purpose: to put another human being on the ground as efficiently as physics would allow. Bruce Lee stood across from him in a posture that violated every principle Dmitri had been taught. His lead foot pointed forward. His rear foot was angled, but not at the standard 45 degrees. It was closer to 15, almost parallel with the lead foot. His weight was distributed roughly 60% on the front leg, which was wrong. In wrestling, you kept your weight back so a charging opponent couldn't drive you off your base. His hands were up, but not at chest height. One was extended in front of him at shoulder level, the other was drawn back near his ribs. He looked like a fencer. He looked like someone who had learned fighting from a book and had gotten the page order confused. Dmitri almost smiled. Almost. He moved first. A short step forward with the lead foot to close distance, followed by a reaching motion with his right hand toward Bruce's left shoulder, the collar tie, the most fundamental control position in Greco-Roman wrestling. Once the hand was on the shoulder, the sequence was automatic. Pull the shoulder down, snap the head, level change, throw. Dmitri had executed this sequence an estimated 11,000 times in training. His hand moved toward Bruce's shoulder the way a key moves toward a lock, with mechanical certainty, with the absolute expectation that the target would be where the hand expected it to be. Bruce was not there. He had not stepped backward. Dmitri's eyes registered that immediately, because backward was the direction he had been trained to anticipate and pursue. When a fighter retreated from a wrestler's advance, the wrestler followed. The wrestler was always the one moving forward. The other person was always the one moving back. That was the geometry of wrestling. Straight lines, forward pressure. The wall behind the retreating man getting closer with every step until there was nowhere left to go. But Bruce had moved laterally. Not to the left, not to the right, at an angle. Approximately 40 degrees off the center line, a direction that existed in the dead space between Dmitri's peripheral vision and his trained pursuit path. Dmitri's hand closed on air. His momentum carried him a half step past the point where Bruce had been standing. He reset, adjusted his angle, moved forward again. Bruce redirected. This time Dmitri saw more of the movement and understood less of it. Bruce's lead hand made contact with Dmitri's reaching wrist. Not a grab, not a block, a touch, 2 fingers and a thumb on the inside of the wrist, pressing laterally with what felt like almost no force. But the angle of the press was precise enough that Dmitri's hand, which weighed 11 ounces more than Bruce's, traveled in a circular path that carried it wide of Bruce's shoulder and pulled Dmitri's own center of gravity 2 inches to the left. 2 inches. In wrestling, 2 inches was the distance between a clean throw and an empty grip. Dmitri stumbled. Not dramatically, not enough that anyone watching from the bleachers of an Olympic venue would have noticed, but enough that Valentina noticed. And Valentina noticed everything. Dmitri reset again. This time he did not reach. He changed levels, dropped his hips, lowered his center of gravity, and exploded forward in a double leg takedown. This was the highest percentage attack in all of wrestling. A properly executed double leg by a trained Greco-Roman wrestler against a standing opponent was, according to Soviet training data, successful 87% of the time, regardless of the opponent's discipline. It worked on boxers, it worked on judoka, it worked on karateka, it worked on anyone who was standing upright when it arrived because the human body was not designed to resist 198 pounds of lateral force applied simultaneously to both legs, below the knee. Bruce sprawled, but not the way wrestlers sprawl. A wrestler's sprawl was a defensive reaction, hips shooting backward, chest driving down onto the attacker's back, hands fighting for head control. It was effective, but it was reactive. It conceded that the attacker had initiated successfully, and the defender was now playing catch-up. Bruce's sprawl was not reactive. It was something Valentina had never seen, and it took her several seconds to decode what she was watching. As Dmitri's hands reached for Bruce's legs, Bruce's hips did drop, but not backward. They dropped straight down, compressing his stance, lowering his center of gravity to a point below Dmitri's driving shoulder. Simultaneously, Bruce's right hand found the back of Dmitri's neck, not slapped onto it, placed with the specificity of a surgeon positioning a scalpel. His forearm settled across Dmitri's upper spine, and Bruce applied downward pressure, not with his arm, with his entire body weight channeled through the forearm like water through a funnel. Dmitri's face met the mat. His own momentum had been redirected downward by a fulcrum he did not see until he was underneath it. He was now prone, chest on the rubber, arms extended. The Chinese man was kneeling beside him with one hand on the back of his neck, pressing with what felt like the weight of a small car, but could not possibly be, because the man attached to the hand weighed 135 pounds. Dmitri tried to roll. In wrestling, when you are flattened, you roll to your back to create a guard position, or you roll to your knees to rebuild your base. Either direction gives you options. Dmitri rolled left. Bruce's hand did not move from his neck, but the pressure shifted. Fractionally, imperceptibly, in a way that turned Dmitri's rolling momentum into rotational energy that spent itself before his shoulder cleared the mat. He ended up exactly where he started, face down, hand on his neck. He tried rolling right. The same thing happened. The pressure adjusted. The energy dissipated. He went nowhere. He tried to stand. He placed both palms flat on the mat and pushed upward with the full force of his legs and back. 198 pounds of Olympic-level explosive power driving straight up against gravity. Bruce's weight shifted again. Not dramatically, not visibly, if you were watching from across the room, but Dmitri felt it, a redistribution of pressure from the neck to the shoulder blade, an angle change of maybe 5 degrees, and suddenly pushing up felt like pushing against the floor of the ocean. The harder he pressed, the more the force redirected back into his own structure. He was fighting himself. His own strength was being returned to him at an angle that cancelled his upward drive. He had been on the ground for approximately 12 seconds. It felt like an hour. Valentina said one word, "Dostatokno, enough." Dmitri went still, not because the word meant the match was over. He went still because he recognized the tone. It was the tone Valentina used when she had seen what she needed to see, and additional data would be redundant. He had heard it perhaps 30 times in 6 years. It always meant the same thing. Stop, I have enough information. What happens next is my concern, not yours. Dmitri stood. Bruce's hand released his neck as casually as a man lifting his fingers off a table. There was no theatrical moment, no lingering grip, no display of dominance. The hand was there, and then it was not. And Dmitri was standing, and Bruce was standing exactly where he had been standing before the entire exchange began. The same 2-foot radius, the same towel on the same shoulder, the same breathing pattern, short, controlled, unbothered. Dmitri stepped off the mat. He did not look at Bruce. He looked at Valentina, and in his eyes was something she had never seen in 6 years of coaching him. Not defeat. Defeat she knew. Defeat looked like exhaustion and anger and broken posture. This was different. This was confusion. Dmitri Volkov, who had been wrestling since he was 7 years old, who spoke the language of physical combat the way other men spoke Russian, had just encountered a sentence he could not pass. He had been taken to the ground by his own attack, held in place by a man who weighed 60 pounds less than him, and he could not explain how any of it had happened. Valentina turned to Grigory. Grigory Pavlovich was a different animal. Where Dmitri was explosive and young and aggressive, Grigory was patient and heavy and old. 29, 220 pounds. He had competed in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics and taken silver in freestyle 100 kilogram, the only silver medalist Valentina had ever retained in her program, because she believed his loss in Tokyo was a judging error, not a performance failure. He had been wrestling for 22 years. He did not lunge. He did not shoot. He walked, slowly, arms wide, base low, making the space smaller with every step the way a tide makes a beach smaller. Not with violence, but with inevitability. This was the Soviet pressure method, Valentina's method. Control the space, remove options, make the opponent's world shrink until the only direction left was down. Grigory stepped onto the mat. He did not settle into a stance. He simply began walking toward Bruce, arms open, fingers spread, palms facing inward. Each step covered approximately 14 inches. His hips were low, his back was straight. He looked like a man walking through waist-deep water, unhurried, unstoppable, enormous. Bruce watched him come. For the first 3 steps, Bruce did what he had done with Dmitri. He shifted laterally, looking for the angle, looking for the dead space in Grigory's field of pressure. But Grigory was not Dmitri. Grigory's arms were wider, his steps were shorter, but his base was broader, and with every step he adjusted his angle to match Bruce's lateral movement, cutting off the escape route before Bruce could fully commit to it. Grigory was not chasing, he was herding, and he was very, very good at it. For the first time, Bruce stepped backward. Valentina leaned forward. She recognized this. She had seen it 1,000 times. The moment a striker realized that a wrestler controlled the geometry of the fight. The moment the striker's lateral movement was neutralized, and the only direction left was backward, toward the wall, toward the corner, toward the shrinking box that ended with your back against something solid and a wrestler's hands on your body. Every striker reached this moment eventually, and every striker, without exception, lost the fight within seconds of reaching it. Bruce took a second step back. His radius was shrinking. Grigori was 4 feet away, 3 feet. Bruce's back was 6 feet from the wall, 5 feet. The gymnasium felt smaller with every step. The fluorescent light buzzed louder. The dripping pipe counted seconds. Then Bruce did something that made Valentina's breath catch in her throat. He dropped his hands, both of them. From the extended guard position to his sides, his arms hung loose, his shoulders settled, his chin lowered slightly. He looked from every angle Valentina could process, like a man who had given up, like a man whose body had decided the math was finished, and the answer was loss. She had seen this posture before. She had seen it from boxers who knew the knockout was coming. She had seen it from wrestlers who had been ground down for 6 minutes and had nothing left. She had seen it from every fighter who reached the point where their body's survival instinct overrode their competitive will and said, quietly, irrevocably, "Stop fighting. It's over." Grigori saw it too, and because Grigori was experienced and patient and not the kind of man who rushed, he took one more careful step forward. He was within arm's reach now. His right hand moved toward Bruce's left shoulder. Slowly, carefully, the way you reach for something you've been hunting for a long time and do not want to startle at the last moment. His fingertips touched the fabric of the towel draped over Bruce's shoulder, and the world rearranged itself. Bruce's center of gravity moved. Not his feet, not his hands. His center, the invisible point somewhere behind his navel, where balance and mass and intention converge, shifted 2 inches to the left. That was all, 2 inches. The distance a candle flame moves when someone opens a door in another room. Grigori's hand, which had been reaching for a shoulder, was now reaching for empty space. His fingers closed on the towel, which slid off Bruce's shoulder like water off glass, and for a fraction of a second, Grigori was holding a towel instead of a man, and his weight was committed forward into a target that no longer existed. In that fraction of a second, Bruce's right hand pressed against Grigori's left elbow. Not a strike, not a grab, a press. Directional, specific, applied along the vector of Grigori's own forward momentum, so that instead of being stopped, Grigori was accelerated past Bruce, past the center of the mat, past the point where his feet could recover his balance. His own 220 pounds of forward pressure, which had been his greatest weapon 30 seconds ago, was now a force he could not stop, aimed at a wall he could not avoid. Grigori hit the wall with his right shoulder. The impact was not violent. It was controlled. Bruce's hand on the elbow had steered him, the way a rudder steers a ship, so that the collision was a bump, not a crash. Grigori was not hurt, but he was now behind Bruce, and Bruce was back in the center of the mat, and the geography of the fight had inverted completely. The wall had never been behind Bruce. It had always been behind Grigori. Bruce had not retreated toward it. He had led Grigori to it, step by step, using Grigori's own certainty as the leash. Grigori turned from the wall. His patience was thinner now. He charged, not the careful pressure walk, a full-speed driving attack, both arms reaching, 220 pounds accelerating across 8 feet of mat space. Bruce intercepted him with a straight blast. 3 rapid punches delivered in a single forward motion. Not hooks, not crosses, straight punches along the center line, each one landing on Grigori's sternum with a sound like someone clapping a hardcover book shut. They were not powerful enough to injure. They were calibrated, precise enough to stop 220 pounds of forward momentum without breaking the sternum beneath them. Grigori's feet stopped. His torso kept moving. He folded forward. Not much. 3 inches. But 3 inches was enough. Bruce was already behind him. One hand on Grigori's collar. One hand on the waistband of his training pants. The exact position a wrestler uses to control an opponent from the rear. Textbook. Soviet textbook. The same control position Valentina had drilled into her athletes 10,000 times. Except Bruce was not a wrestler. He was using Grigori's own art against him, reflecting it. Like a mirror. like a man who had watched the system operate for 60 seconds and absorbed enough of its language to speak it back fluently. Valentina said the word again, dostatokno. Grigori stopped. Bruce released him, stepped back, picked up the towel from the floor where it had fallen, draped it over his shoulder again, returned to the center of the mat. Same spot, same breathing, same stillness. Valentina stepped onto the mat herself, not to fight. Her athletes parted to let her pass. She walked to where Bruce was standing. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall. She looked up at him by 1 inch. She studied his face the way she had studied 10,000 fighters' faces across 19 years, looking for the tell, the pride, the satisfaction, the subtle inflation of ego that every fighter displayed after winning, even the humble ones, even the quiet ones. There was always something, a change in the eyes, a lift in the shoulders, a fractional straightening of the spine that said, I won and I know it, and I want you to know I know it. There was nothing. Bruce Lee's face was exactly what it had been when she walked through the door, calm, present, assessing. He had not won anything because he had not been competing. He had been demonstrating. Not his skill, not his system, something else entirely, something she could not yet name. She asked through Elena, the only question that mattered, who taught you to wrestle? Bruce's answer landed like a stone dropped into still water. You did, just now. I watched Dmitri for 15 seconds. I watched Grigori for 30. Elena translated. Valentina heard the words. She processed them, and then she sat down. Not because her legs were tired, not because the moment demanded deference. She sat because the floor had shifted beneath the belief she had carried since Stalingrad, that the system was everything, and the person was the vehicle. She was looking at a man who had no system, who was, himself, the system, who absorbed whatever you brought to him, and reflected it back with a precision that made your own art feel foreign in your own hands. He had not defeated Dmitri with Jeet Kune Do. He had not defeated Grigori with Wing Chun, or boxing, or fencing. He had defeated them with wrestling. Their wrestling. The wrestling she had spent 19 years perfecting. He had watched it for 45 seconds and understood it well enough to use it against 2 men who had trained in it their entire lives. She sat on the mat and she looked at him and she said, in Russian, a phrase that Elena translated quietly, "You are not a fighter. You are something I don't have a word for." Bruce sat down across from her. He crossed his legs. He placed the towel beside him, and for the next 40 minutes, through Elena, they talked. Not about technique, not about competition, not about who would beat whom. They talked about philosophy, about movement, about the difference between learning a system and understanding a principle. Valentina asked about Wing Chun, and Bruce explained that it was where he started, not where he stayed. She asked about the fencing elements in his footwork, and he told her about his brother Peter, who fenced in Hong Kong, and how Bruce had stolen his lateral movement and built it into something that belonged to no category. She asked about his punching structure, and he talked about Western boxing, about Muhammad Ali's jab, about how he had studied Ali's hip rotation on film for 200 hours and extracted the 3% of it that applied to a man who weighed 100 pounds less than Ali. And then Valentina told him about Stalingrad, about her mother walking through rubble, about the shell casings and the plaster dust, and the sound of artillery that became so constant it replaced silence, about how she had learnt that strength was repetition, the same movement, the same path, the same relentless pressure, night after night, until the thing that was trying to stop you simply broke. She told him this was how she coached. This was how the Soviet Union built athletes. Repetition, pressure, inevitability. Bruce listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said something that Elena translated and that Valentina would remember for the rest of her life. Your mother didn't survive because she repeated. She survived because she adapted. The path through rubble is different every night. The rubble shifts. The fires move. She made it to the factory, not because she followed the same route, but because she found a new one every time. You named it repetition. I think it was something else. I think it was water. Valentina stared at him. She opened her mouth to respond. She closed it. She opened it again and said, slowly, in Russian, with Elena translating, "In Russia we say the river does not fight the rock. It goes around." Bruce smiled. It was the first time his expression had changed since she entered the gymnasium. He said, "Someone once told me to be water." Valentina stood. She extended her hand. Bruce took it. She held it for 5 seconds longer than a handshake should last. She looked into his eyes and said, in Russian, a phrase Elena translated into the quiet gymnasium with the dripping pipe and the buzzing light. "I will not forget you." Bruce nodded. He picked up his towel and his canvas shoes from beside the wooden dummy. He walked to the door. He stepped through it into the Mexican sunlight and turned left toward the Olympic Village and disappeared into a crowd of athletes and tourists and vendors selling paper flags, and within 30 seconds there was no trace of him in the street. Just a thin man in canvas shoes carrying a towel, vanishing into the ordinary world like he had never disrupted an extraordinary one. Valentina stood in the gymnasium for another 2 minutes. Dmitri and Grigori waited by the door. Elena held her notebook against her chest. Nobody spoke. The 1968 Olympics continued. Valentina's team competed 4 days later. Dmitry Volkov won bronze in the Greco-Roman 90-kilogram class. Grigory Pavlovich reached the final of the freestyle 100-kilogram class. He lost. The gold went to a Japanese judoka crossover named Hayashi, who fought with an unusual style. Instead of driving forward with pressure, Hayashi redirected his opponent's energy laterally, using their own force to create the angles for his throws. Grigory was taken down 3 times in the final by a technique he could not counter, not because he didn't understand it mechanically, but because every time Hayashi moved, Grigory saw someone else. After the match, standing in the tunnel beneath the arena, his silver medal in his hand, Grigory said to Valentina, "He moved like the Chinese man." Valentina nodded. She said nothing. Grigory Pavlovich was not reassigned to Siberia. He was the first silver medalist Valentina ever kept. She never explained why. In 1973, Bruce Lee died in Hong Kong. He was 32 years old. The news reached the Soviet Sports Ministry through a clipping service that monitored international publications for mentions of notable athletes and martial artists. The clipping was filed and forgotten by everyone except one person. Valentina Kuznetsova requested the clipping. She cut out the photograph that accompanied the article. She placed it in a plain wooden frame, and she hung it on the wall of her office at the Soviet National Training Center in Moscow, beside 6 Olympic gold medals, 14 World Championship certificates, and a framed photograph of her mother standing in front of the Barakadi factory in 1946. No one asked her about the photograph for 20 years. In 1993, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a Russian sports journalist named Arkady Petrov published a retrospective article on Valentina Kuznetsova's coaching legacy. In the final paragraph, he noted that her office wall contained a single photograph that was not of any of her athletes. When he asked her who the man in the photograph was, Valentina, who was then 66 years old, retired, living in a small apartment in Volgograd with a cat and the same plain wooden frame on the wall above her desk, said only this: "He showed me something I hadn't seen." Petrov pressed her for details. She declined. He asked for a name. She shook her head. He pointed out that a coaching legacy article, without attribution for the photograph, would seem incomplete. Valentina looked at the frame. She looked at the journalist. And she said, with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire life choosing her words the way her wrestlers chose their grips, carefully, deliberately, and without waste, "Write this. I spent 19 years believing I had seen every way a human being could move. I was wrong. I saw a man move once, in a gymnasium in Mexico City, and I have been thinking about that movement for 25 years. I do not know how he did it. I do not know if anyone will ever do it again. I know only that he was 135 pounds and he sat me down on a mat without touching me. Write that, and write that. I kept his photograph because some things you see once and they change the way you see everything else." Petrov wrote it. The article was published in Sportivnaya Rossiya in March of 1993. It was read by 11,000 people. The paragraph about the photograph was quoted once, in a footnote, in a doctoral thesis on Soviet coaching methodology at Moscow State University. The thesis was read by 4 people, but in a small apartment in Volgograd, above a desk cluttered with old training manuals and a sleeping cat, a photograph of a young man with high cheekbones and dark eyes and a towel over his shoulder remained on the wall. And every morning before she made her tea, before she opened the curtains, before she began another day in a world that had changed beyond recognition, since the day she watched her mother walk through rubble, Valentina Nikolaevna Kuznetsova looked at that photograph, and she remembered the day she sat down,